Welcome to Postscript, a podcast from Tribune magazine. I'm your host, Barnaby Rain, and I'm joined today for a very special episode by Paul Gilroy. Thank you for joining me. Across decades of writing, Paul has given us ways to think about race and the nation, and against both, he asks us to imagine forms of community where everyone is free. We're going to cover a lot of ground, so I wanted to start by asking you about some early influences. How did your parents and their world shape the kind of thinking and being and feeling that became you?
I owe them a great deal because they were intellectuals. Well, I didn't know that at the time. And so there were always books around and time to think and digest ideas. And there are certain things, I guess, I mean, who knows what, I don't know if a child ever understands their parents' togetherness, but I got a lot from them. I think my mother, as a writer, taught me to love language and to love manipulating language, and particularly poetry. I guess I can say that I was particularly influenced by her love of English poetry. And with my dad, it's harder to say, really. I guess they were political people. He had had a life in the communist world. He had been a student at UCL of Haldane's, and he had become a
Marxist scientist.
Yes, who abandoned this country and went off to live in India after Suez, 1956. And he had been a conscientious objector in World War II, so I suppose that was something that, in the context of the sort of militarism of the 1950s and the kind of Cold War environment, you know, everyone else's father and many of their mothers had been people in military uniforms, you know, and so I obviously, as a child, you're a kind of detective. You want to understand where you come from, and it was a puzzle to me that my dad didn't have that in his life. So I guess that I picked up something of his pacifism, even as it mutated in the Cold War environment. I picked up my mum's love of literature and her antipathy towards the racial order. Where the flats where we lived in Woodside Park,
in
North London, we lived on a section of the ground floor of a large old, I guess, grand Edwardian house. And there were other families that lived in that building from other parts of the world. There were some gay men that lived upstairs. There were Indian and Jamaican families that came and lived there. And I guess I was about 7 years old. I should say that this house had a huge, huge garden that stretched across maybe a kilometre down to the northern line, and the road at the bottom there. And when I was 7 or 8 years old, the landlord, Mr. Baker, I remember his name, sold the land of the garden and sold it to a developer who built a housing estate there. And so one of my, I would say, key formative experience is watching the bulldozers and the chainsaws come and destroy this place which had been my playground. Rather unusually, a place where I used to watch the cuckoo come and cuckoo from the tree and so on. And the sort of tragedy of that loss and the despoliation of that environment was something that I took on very, very, very deeply. And my dad used to like to walk. Sometimes we would go out and walk around the place, around the edges of North London, and look at things and listen to things. And so I took a lot of my, I suppose, what would become my kind of political ecology I found in my relationship with him, perhaps more. My mum didn't really, I mean, she talked a lot about Guyana and wrote stories and recovered the history of her formation there as part of the work she did producing literature for children initially, and that's very enriching. A lot of those stories were told to myself and my sister before they were published. But she knew English plants and flowers and flora and fauna, let's say, from the colonial education that she had received. So there was a meeting ground there, although journeying out of London into the hinterlands of English, more rural life was always a rather ambivalent experience for a mixed family.
Already there we have almost the first thing you say is having free time and then being able to share space. And I really think of these as two very enduring kinds of ideas of the real grounded meaning of freedom in things that you've written over a long period. People need to have time, and people need to have beautiful spaces to share with each other.
Yes, they need to make them.
They need to make them, yeah. And we make spaces. They're not just where we come from. How it makes me wonder how aware you were growing up of the politics of Guyana, and how much your insistent opposition to identity thinking of all kinds emerged in some kind of dialogue with
all of that.
You know, I mean, I think of like Walter Rodney's sense that the division between African descended and Asian descended communities in Guyana was central to the reproduction of misery for both. And I wonder if that played a role in your.
Well, it did, but only really indirectly. I mean, my mother was friends with Jessie Burnham, who I remember visiting us, and of course lots of Guyanese visitors. And, you know, as a child, you can't really decode people's political positions. You're just trying to make sense of the differences and the sort of kinship, the larger world of kin that opens up in front of you. I guess I'd say that, you know, a lot of those Guyanese connections that we had were people who had been in the war. So before we get to what happened later, we have to deal with that. And the person who was presented to me as a Guyanese uncle, who my mum was very close to for a long time, was someone who'd been shot down over the English Channel on a bombing raid. Was a bomber navigator, an observer, an officer in the bombing of Europe. And I mean, there are many of those stories, of course, and it's very interesting. I don't know if you're familiar with the poetry or the autobiographical writings of Cy Grant, probably one of the first black performers on UK TV, singing calypsos on the television. We didn't have a television much of the time I was a child. Anyway, Cy wrote a beautiful autobiography of his experiences of being shot down over the Netherlands, and you know, the sort of Dutch people who found him in a cornfield saying to him, well, we're terribly sorry once they've given him tea and coffee. We're really sorry, but we've had to tell the Germans that you're here, and they'll be coming along to get you in 20 minutes. You know, I hope you don't mind. We listen to the BBC every evening. So, but our kin in our family, I found out much later that my uncle had been, you know, shot down by the Germans and had spent 3 days in the water before he was fished out and rescued. So what I'm trying to say is that those war experiences are also part of my developing sense of what it is to be attached to a nation, where war fits in relation to national identity.
I remember talking to you about your musical interests in childhood and teenage years also coming from some kind of relationship to your parents and a partly reaction against, because your dad, I think, knew composers of a classical strain who were different from the kinds of music you became interested in?
Well, my dad was in a sort of circle of people that were connected indirectly, I guess, and directly to Benjamin Britten and that sort of version of, I don't know what to call it, sort of sandal-wearing kind of. I mean, obviously Britain is gay, so there's a whole. That's another layer of it. But that wasn't where my interest in music came from. I think my interest in music initially came from my ecstatic experiences of church music as a choir boy, because I again, you know, I don't know how old I was, maybe 8, 9, 10 years old. I used to sing in choirs and sang in the choir. My parents weren't religious people. My dad was an atheist. My mum, I think in her later years, we can say, became very, although she'd been raised, I think, as a Catholic, she became sympathetic to Quakerism. But they weren't people who were going to church every Sunday. But I went to church because I wanted to sing in the choir, which I did. And you got pocket money. You got paid to sing in the church. So I used to sing at people's weddings and sing in special services and things like that. And my earliest sort of experiences of ecstatic relationship with sound, I suppose you could say, was really singing the Messiah and things like that as a child, really. And I still I savor that memory, because I think, I mean, my mum played the piano, so there's music anyway, but the absolute ecstasy, the transcendent experience of music, the low notes on the organ, all of that, the physicality of those low notes on the organ, that was all part, I think, of my desire to see what music could do in the world. And I didn't connect it to an experience of being free until much later. But yes, I think there's something I brought with me out of childhood into my writing that is associated with that.
I mean, there's such a long tradition of people thinking about the process of musical creation as a kind of freedom, as a kind of expression of individuality, but also an expression of community. I was talking to you before about the experience of like a jam session where people both come alive as individuals and also talk to each other musically and relate to each other. So yeah, I've always wondered if your ways of thinking about human freedom are embedded in ways of feeling and thinking about music.
Well, that is absolutely the case, but I think London was an incredible place for listening to all kinds of music through what I would call the long 1970s. And by the long 1970s, I'm really talking about the period in which I began to get active in going out to seek and find those fleeting encounters with not only freedom, but with a world that we wanted to bring into being. So there's two things. There's hearing it coming, and there's also the actual, as it were, somatic exposure to things that are transcendent in their character. And for me, the long 1970s really is that, because I started going out to listen to live music, I suppose, when I was about 13. And
69.
69, yeah. I mean, I've got some cuttings from the Isle of Wight Festival from 1969, because I got interviewed by the Daily Mail in the crowd. I got into trouble at school for talking about drug use and things like that from the journalists who picked me out to talk to at the Isle of Wight when we went to hear Bob Dylan. And then another thing which came out of that experience was that obviously in some ways one reveres Bob Dylan, you know, beyond Bob Dylan's. It goes beyond a point of it being anything to do with him. But I learned something very profound for me about that, because I'd gone to hear Dylan, I was really excited to hear him. And you spend 3 days in a festival, you know, getting by, waiting for the musicians you want to hear to come on. And Dylan came on, and I fell asleep, and only woke up when the encore was played. So I think there was a life lesson there that I learned about anticipation, about not falling asleep at the critical time, about having the experience of missing the meaning, if you like, something along those lines that was salutary. You know.
I find that difficult. Being present in the present and
the difficulties involved in being really present, especially when things are, you know, what's the word? Saturated with desire, with meaning, with a yearning for freedom. as a young person, in particular, I think.
How, I wonder how consciously politically you then thought about the yearning for freedom. I know that relatively early on you were eager to participate in some kind of left, that you, I think, had a moment in a sort of semi-Maoist group and then became involved with Big Flame.
Well, before that, when we were at school, we were involved in things because there was a group, I suppose it must have been a sort of offshoot of the Communist Party in some way, called the Schools Action Union. And I'm thinking here really 70-71 sort of miners' strike. The government at that time tried to take away our free passes for travelling on the bus, and we had a big campaign around that. Led, I think, mostly by young women from Camden, who I guess you could say was the emergence of women's liberation, because all the girls that we knew began to meet and talk about women's liberation, and we were excluded from that. So in a way, you want to know. Being excluded makes you even more determined to find out. And the other thing, which sort of was a hinge for me, was going to sit in the court at the Old Bailey when the Oz trial was on, and seeing what
magazine, we should explain. Magazine being censored.
Yes. Well, the magazine was being censored because it was judged obscene under the old legal arrangements for categorizing obscene publications. And I felt strongly about this because we used to read this magazine all the time. And at one point they had advertised inside the magazine for school children to come and take over the magazine and have a special issue that would be edited by young people. Well, I think we all sort of talked about whether we wanted to go and join in with this. I was keener than the others. I mean, I didn't smoke weed in those days, but they were all absolutely out of their minds and couldn't find the energy to go and join in. So, when they were all arrested, it was really quite a shock, actually. And the viciousness. I mean, I know that probably there are ways of thinking the history of this country through obscenity trials, going back, certainly more than a century. And the role of the Lord Chamberlain's office and all of these, as it were, arcane institutions of the British state, which make cultural judgments, which are also criminal judgments, also juridical judgments about what people can and can't read, what they can and can't think, and so on. So, as it were, the hippie answer to that, the hippie answer to it, is not the left answer to it. But in this era, which formed me, I would say there's a kind of overlap between the kind of, let's call it the hippie answer, which is an autonomist, a libertarian one, which says, and the kind of left answer, which is to say, these things have to become intelligible within a systematic account of class contradictions and conflicts, albeit within a kind of cultural frame. And so I sat there in that trial in the Old Bailey. Probably the most profound thing was what I learned from watching the judge conduct the trial, and how biased, aggressive, partial, and abusive that process was. So this was, for me, in a way, this is a kind of crash course that I brought with me into my understanding of what government, what state, what the law, what these things actually add up to in practice. And I'm a teenager, but again, I kind of saw it as it were, in its rawest, in its rawest variety, because I remember at the end of the trial them being found guilty and taken away. The first thing, their hair was all cut, and it was a kind of assault. And I mean, I can't remember the exact years and so on of all of this, but it kind of connected up very much with the things we were reading about that were happening in the US, the Chicago conspiracy trial, the kind of abuse of the radical movement, the black movement, and the weather under, all of these sorts of things which we're beginning to kind of be exposed to through a kind of underground world of journalistic communication, which is terribly enriching of life and expansive with regard to what freedom was and what it would be and how it would connect across the world. But certainly our exposure, our immediate exposure to it, was really through to the Oz trial and other related things being stopped, because this is also the time when, if one's out and about, you begin to come into conflict with the police. You begin to be stopped, you begin to be searched in the street, and all of that kind of thing. So it's not very hard to join the dots from all of that into, at least you might not quite yet know the world you want, but you begin to, in its negative aspect, you begin to realise the things you don't want. So it's not just about freedom, it's also about understanding the things that have to go, the things that have to be disposed of, if something like those germs of a freedom-seeking or freedom-finding kind of cultural life can mature, you know?
It's the only way I know of thinking about freedom is through negation.
Negation, yeah.
And I think, I mean, actually one way I've always read your work is in that philosophical tradition of immanent critique, in which you begin by asking, not what are my eternal moral laws, but where am I situated? And what about the oppressions, the subjugations, the subjection, the way that I'm made as a person has within it the seed of a contradiction, of something different. I mean, that's exactly the tradition in which I read you, I hope that's not mistaken.
No, that's true. In a way, I found that tradition in my education as an undergraduate, really, and I know there's a lot of interest in the work of Gillian Rose now. She was a fantastic teacher for me at that time, and I'm immensely grateful to her for the things that I learned through our conversations. And I would say that's how I began, through that exposure to her mind and her thinking and her writing, was to be able to name that and understand it and sort of place myself with the resources that it unlocked, because, you know, it was really through my education at her hands that I began to read Marx in a different way, to read Hegel, Nietzsche, you know, to think Schopenhauer, to think a little bit about all, and then of course, you know, Lukács and Bloch and Brecht, who I sort of like to think I brought some of that into my own work. Although, you know, when I went to Birmingham, which Gillian advised me not to do, don't go there, sort of thing.
So let's give people a very quick summary. You went to Sussex.
Yeah, I went to Sussex.
Where
she
you
was
were
teaching.
taught by Gillian Rose, who was a very not so famous.
Sorry.
No, don't be sorry at all. But a very brilliantly interesting thinker who was not so celebrated in her lifetime, maybe as since, whose wonderful, big, very challenging book on Hegel contra sociology establishes something like a kind of vision of a kind of immanent freedom, what she calls an absolute ethical life. And then from Sussex, you went to Birmingham, where you studied with Stuart Hall and Richard Johnson in the cultural studies moment. Sorry to interject all that detail.
It's good to pause and explain things. I'm sorry, I was taking too much for granted, and I'll try and proceed more carefully now. I guess, you know, you want to do. I wanted to go on studying, and I had seen Stuart Hall talking and was very impressed by his command of things, and hadn't read at that time a lot of what he'd written, but some of it had got through to me, and I thought, well, that's an exciting prospect, and here's someone who was black and was, you know, Jamaican heritage and all of this, and so I thought, well, you know. And I managed to get, in those days you could get money to study. You didn't have to pay. And that's important to me too, because that's not utopia. That's something I lived for, you know, for at least 6 years. The government gave me money to study and think, and nobody stood over me, and nobody bullied me. Well, a little bit, but not really in anything comparable to the kind of regime of education which is now thought to be cast in stone and without alternative. So I was a bit surprised in a way that none of the sort of German idealist tradition and the critique of the German idealist tradition, none of that was really, it wasn't central at all. I think they were all completely within a world of French structural Marxism and You know, and then the things that they were doing with the radical criminology of the time, which was so vividly present in the collectively produced books that they were making at that time. The most celebrated of which, rightly celebrated, is of course Policing the Crisis, a book that had an incredible life and incredible impact on the work of radical thinkers in all kinds of situations. So I was a bit surprised because my points of my orientation, the world I was bringing with me, wasn't there. And the other thing that wasn't there, which is really important to me, which I'd also I'd seen and been exposed to in Sussex, but I'd also had before I went there, was the life of African American commentators in relation to Marxism, in relation to the freedom struggles of Black America over 2 centuries. And one of my other teachers at Sussex was Cora Kaplan, who was somebody who'd come from a kind of US left formation and whose father, Sidney Kaplan, was a real, one of the people that was involved in the sort of one of the white communist Jewish men who was involved in the, as it were, infrastructure of African Black studies as it unfolded in the United States. So through her and the friendship that grew on our experiences of being pupil and teacher, then that was kind of nourished and extended. And so I didn't really understand why someone like Du Bois wasn't thought of. W.B. Du Bois, the African-American sort of magus, sometime communist, sometime liberal, sometime socialist, sometime humanist thinker, born the same year as Gandhi, but lives until 1961, 62, is deprived of his citizenship in the US and becomes eventually a citizen of Ghana in his 90s. So Du Bois was, at that point, I think from my teenage life at school, Du Bois was someone I had been reading and thinking with and thinking about. And I just couldn't find any map or any set of resources which included the sort of German stuff, the Black stuff, the French stuff. I mean, I did begin to find some of these combinations later in my life when I met some African American people who had had the same problems I had Cornel West or Bell Hooks. These people who became friends and peers and so on were people who had had some of the same problems that I had had in trying to fight against their education and from that conflict to find resources with which to think the world freshly, hopefully. That's so my sort of my association and comradeship with those people was very much based on trying to reconcile these different influences and to think Africa, think Pan-Africanism, think anti-imperialism in a kind of global frame, really, which was something that, you know, Marxism in its English variants was not really able to do. And the absolute nationalism of, you know, some of the most important and significant writers and thinkers within the tradition of English Marxism, English cultural criticism. These were people who were, in a way, fighting their way out of a set of illusions about nationalism. But it was very uneven. You know, I think in the context of Raymond Williams, who was Welsh and sort of had a rather disjuncted kind of class predicament.
So Williams comes from, one of the founders of cultural studies, comes from a Welsh hamlet where his father was a railway signalman, and to Cambridge, and writes about the feeling of alienation. Has this beautiful moment talking about he was alienated by the talk of culture at Cambridge. He says, not in the lecture halls, but in the tea room, where the wealthiest students would gather and whinny the word culture as if it was something that he didn't have in working class Wales. You know, so I mean, cultural studies as a project that you were coming to, the project of thinking, which was a deeply political project from its inception, the project of saying we have to understand how people are really made if we want to remake the world. It was a project, and we have to think in broader categories than economy and planning when we're thinking about politics. It was a project made by outsiders to different. I mean, Williams' Welshness, Hall coming from Jamaica, and from a displacement within Jamaica as a more middle-class, sort of light-skinned family in Jamaica, and then Hoggart as well as a Yorkshireman. So it had that outsider
but you're leaving
quality.
out Edward Thompson. So
good. Okay.
That's not, because, you know, for me as a graduate student,
who was a more patrician English, we should say,
well,
Thompson.
patrician, I don't know. Yeah, in formation, that's certainly true, I think, but also a traitor to all of that.
Oh,
in
totally.
A way
Very
that was,
importantly,
I think,
yeah.
important. I like the traitors. I tend to like the traitors in that world. But I think that question of how nationalism distorts cultural studies, I mean, Hoggart, yeah, I mean, this is a whole program on its own, really. But let's just say that the foundations of cultural studies in its local iteration are all ambiguously placed in relation to the politics of race and nation. And by this time I was trying to think about what I was going to do for my PhD and what I would write about, and I didn't really feel I had lots of other interests, and I had been given a grant to do something that was very different from what I ended up doing. But I didn't feel I had any alternative but to really write about the politics of the moment. And that involved not just, thinking about racialized categories in law and government and policing and so on, in violence, in war, in militarization, but also really how those categories extended into, some would say, polluted the frameworks through which the left was trying to build a left response to Labourism and Thatcherism as it emerged. And that was very difficult because I felt, I couldn't always really rely on the people who were supervising my work to be sympathetic to that, let's say.
Tell me more about that.
Well, I mean, I think when I wrote my thesis, I think I had 6 chapters. I think I only showed 4 to my supervisors because I knew that they
were Stuart Hall and Richard Johnson.
Yeah. Obviously, they didn't share an outlook, but I think.
But are you?
Let me just say before I got to writing my thesis, we had done this book, The Empire Strikes Back, which is more of a what's the word, conjunctural intervention, and I had found this. There's a whole section in Thompson. Edward Thompson's writing about the law, because he was interested in law and the relationship of law and class power.
Albion's Fatal Tree.
Albion's Fatal Tree, and there's a section in that book, Albion's Fatal Tree, which is about poaching in the 18th century and about the rule of law and why it is that once poaching is decided, is made into a capital crime, a crime that can be punished by death, why so few people are put to death once that's happened. And it's an argument really about making an idea of law which is, I wouldn't say generous, but effective, which is effective precisely because its relationship with violence and cruelty is more attenuated. I mean, obviously, there are lots of people thinking about those problems at that time in different ways, in different European traditions of critical writing. I wish there were more people thinking about that now, watching all of these, things that are erupting around us with the law, in which law is now appears to be almost entirely a personal question between the aggrieved victims, often of horrible crimes, and the perpetrators. I suppose, and here I'm probably saying the wrong thing, but I'm very attached to the idea of justice as a blind process. The reason that on top of the Old Bailey there's an effigy of justice with the blindfold across her eyes and the sword and the scales, because I think that the personalization of these, often traumatic and life-transforming horrors, is not really helping us do better law and find a better modes of government that aren't, easily taken away from us by the technology and the political machinations of the populist movement broadly defined. So I prefer an older idea of justice and the rule of law, which is very unfashionable, I'm sure. But I share that with Edward, because Edward, you see, argues for the rule of law in that book.
Right.
But when it comes to the politics of race in the present, outside the courtroom, Edward Thompson, writing the foreword for State Research and all the rest of it, would say, the jury that acquitted John Kingsley Reid of saying saying 1 down, 1 million to go in response to the murder of Gurdeep Singh Chagga, I think it was good. It was in Chicago. It may not. Anyway, one of the horrible racist murders of that moment in the late 70s, Thompson says, that wasn't a racist thing that John Kingsley Reid was saying in Blackburn when he was arraigned for incitement to racial hatred. It was really that the jury, this good old English jury, was much more disposed against punishing a man for his opinions than it was concerned with the nature of those opinions. And that was, when I read that sentence in Edwards' writing, I was absolutely quite shocked and upset, because I thought, why can't you see that that's a problem? What version of England is it you subscribe to? The version of what form of liberty is at stake in rewriting that so as to exclude the question of the racial ordering of our country? So these things, and I mean, okay, when he published it the second time, he took that sentence out, but still, it's a symptom for me. It was a symptom of a certain set of problems that were deeper in character. And actually, I think I was right, and I think subsequent developments have shown that trying to dispose of that particular spot of weakness, of vulnerability in the way that people think about politics and national belonging has proved to be a very enduring problem.
Which is the quest. I mean, one of the very sharp interventions you made by the late 80s in There Ain't No Black in the Union Jack was to suggest that it was a particular problem if Marxists and people in cultural studies wanted to imagine a nation as the site of cultural belonging. It was a particular problem in a moment in which racism was itself changing from a biological language to a cultural language.
Yeah.
So that if you are thinking that the nation is an innocent category culturally, if you're thinking that there are great noble English traditions, which interestingly you're not a million miles from, because you're admiring the statue of the Old Bailey. But if you're thinking, so you want to, it's not a simple rejection on your part. No. But if people are thinking those traditions without being attentive to the exclusions that were written into them or to the hatreds that were written into them, that was a particular danger at a moment when the idea of a cultural tradition was also something that was becoming important to the right. And you've mentioned Thompson in this category. You've also in the past talked about Raymond Williams sometimes in this category. I wonder if one of the implicit kind of objects of that criticism was one of your supervisors, Stuart Hall, because his politics in the 80s, in association with Eurocommunism, was using the language of the national popular. There's a moment in an essay in the early 80s where he registers the astonishing fact that the people can be colonized by the right as a political language. And when I read that sentence, I think of your work and I think, I don't imagine Gilroy would be astonished by that fact in a country like Britain.
I think he was being a bit ironic there.
Okay.
I mean, obviously, Stuart's relationship to these problems, in as much as I understand them, comes through his reliance on Gramscian categories. And so that Antonio Gramsci, the Sardinian Marxist, was incarcerated by the fascists and wrote these kind of, often very cryptic formulations, which are sandwiched between a kind of Leninist outlook and what some of his interpreters describe as the Eurocommunist one, the idea that we can get to a kind of communist outcome electorally. By the slow transformation of institutions and so on. So I think, there's arguments to be had about what kind of reading of Gramsci that might be and so on. But Stuart, I mean, there were a lot of people on the left, I think we can say that, who really believed that some sort of innocent version of nationalism could be sort of extracted, could be salvaged from all of this. And I think there are still people on the left who think this.
Totally.
And who believe in a sort of innocent Englishness.
Totally.
That can, if you just keep scraping,
totally,
you scrape more and more enthusiastically eventually, or peeling or something, whatever. I think I prefer scraping it. You scrape and scrape and scrape and scrape and scrape, layer after layer after layer, or you burn off all the old layers of paint, and underneath is this absolute rapturously beautiful thing that you can inhabit, And I guess I want to say that isn't going to happen, and that the work the work of finding that, I mean, maybe your utopia may not, but the work, you have to put in the work in order to bring that object into being. It's not a matter of no purgative you can find is ever going to be strong enough because it's intrinsic. It's intrinsic to the functioning of institutions, the functioning of political language, to the functioning of law and government, to have these ambiguities. And if you want to find that, and actually, whatever version of democracy we're going to make in this archipelago requires us to find it. If you're going to find it, you're going to have to do a lot more imaginative and creative work, and a lot less archaeological work.
Yeah, it's. Your argument has never been that people should be ashamed or guilty or feel a relation of rejection to what they come from. It seems to me it's that people should rethink, people in this island should rethink the kinds of communities of possibility that we actually live in, beyond the national frame that says there's something called Britain that connects me to this German family who live in a palace and doesn't connect me to people coming across on small boats. It's a question of thinking the kind of real communities that we're in differently.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure about that, Barnaby, because I actually do believe in shame. And I don't believe in guilt, because I think guilt is, Freud's discussion of these distinctions was very nurturing to me when I was writing a book later on called After Empire. So I think the problem about guilt in this context is that it is paralysing. But I think shame ought to be possible and ought to be useful. And I think there are some, settler colonial contexts in which the mobilization of shame has been an important element in the projection of a more habitable national community. I don't know if that's too optimistic, but I think people have every reason to be ashamed of what happened, but they're not responsible for it. I think that's the difference. They're not actually responsible for it, but they are responsible for fixing it. They're responsible for what they need to repair, but though the residuals, in a way, are not their responsibility. So I think in trying to make this political at all, rather than paralysing, rather than inertia-inducing, one has to maybe amplify the distinction between guilt and shame to some extent, and say that the point about I mentioned Freud. Obviously, for him, there's a distinction between mourning, which is within mourning, there are two variants. There is the pathological variation of mourning, and the sort of healthier one, which is working through, and the unhealthy pathological one is melancholia. So I try to argue very strongly that we could leave the guilt in the melancholic version of a response to this, and we could find ways of working through that were, as it were, lubricated by a measure of shame. That was my hope.
I mean, in Freud, mourning knows its object, it knows what it's mourning, and melancholia struggles to know its object. It's repressed.
Yes, it struggles to know its object. Although I was very influenced by the writing that was done by some German Freudians who were implicated in the denazification process in Germany. Alexander and Margarita Mitscherlich. And they're very clear about the value and the virtue of working through. And I know that there's an enormous set of questions pending in how much we can say that Germany has worked through any of these things as it's all resurgent in the moment that we're in. And that's not a conversation that we can really do justice to in this kind of context. But I think there were a lot of people who, in a way, I was writing against, who wanted to make melancholia into the engine of a certain set of political responses, and that this was something that had come into focus, really through the experience that people had in the aftermath of the AIDS and HIV, the sort of mass death of people with HIV. And if you recall, you are not old enough to remember this, but they had a slogan, and their slogan was, "Don't mourn, mobilize." So in a way, you can see the argument in favor of melancholia, because they're saying we have a relationship with melancholia. We can weaponize our refusal to mourn as a way of galvanizing the political intervention we need to make in this context. And I think the problem, although in some ways I'm sympathetic to that response with regard to the forms of violence and the complicity of government in relation to mass death for HIV, I don't think you can sort of switch that response over into other areas and expect everything to kind of line up in quite the same way. So I think it doesn't transfer out of that. Whereas I think some people who are thinking about politics of class and some people who are thinking about politics of gender did imagine that that was the case, that they could transfer something like that into other areas.
The spirit of not mourning, but
not mourning, but mobilising. Whereas I'm saying, actually, be sad you're no longer the world's number one power. Face up to that loss. Work it through. And when we really find out what happened and what made that possible, the forms of, you say violence is a word people toss around so casually these days. I really don't like the casual nature of that, because the full horror of these things, we really can know much of that. We can't experience it as the people who went through it experienced it, but we can know enough, as Sven Lindqvist says. You always know enough. It's not knowledge you lack; it's courage that you lack to act on the knowledge that you have. So I feel quite strongly about that. That we need to have a chance to work through these things, and that means full immersion. It means full immersion in that archive. It means really understanding what happened. And yes, it wasn't you. It wasn't you, but you are, in a sense, responsible for it, and that's where we start. And that's why I suppose the idea of reparation becomes such a resonant one for people at the moment.
And it replaces old stories of progress where we're on a set of train tracks and we're moving from feudalism to capitalism to socialism, with a sense that great wounds have been done, but repair still has this hopeful language. It seems to me that shame doesn't have that hopeful
no,
potential.
It's true. It doesn't. I think it's my understanding of shame is very much develops in relation to a reading of some of the writings of people who came out of the experiences of genocide inside Europe in the Third Reich period. And not all of them are Jewish, and not all of them recover it under the sign of their Judaism. But I'm sure you're familiar with Primo Levi's last book, The Drowned and the Saved, has a beautiful essay on shame in it that I really found very powerful. And there he talks about his relationship with a man who was a fellow inmate with him inside the Auschwitz lager. And it's very hot, so obviously it's all more resonant for us, given the weather outside this building today. And Levy describes finding some water in a pipe while the two men are working alongside each other, and choosing to keep that water for himself and conceal it rather than share it with his fellow prisoner. And he talks, I think, in a very powerful way about the damage that did to their relationship subsequently. And I was always very, very struck by that.
I'm struck by that passage, discussion, because it always seemed to me that it was a horrible wrong that Primo Levi felt ashamed of that.
Really?
That it's a case where, where he should have been able to understand the force of the brutality of his conditions. There's an essay we've discussed, the amazing magazine Vedem that was kept by children in Theresienstadt. And there's an extraordinary essay as Yom Kippur approaches, the Day of Atonement, where the children ask, what is it to mourn our sins in a concentration camp, in a world where we are being sinned against so enormously. And I know you'd want to push against the idea that sort of to talk about the grand and the structural means that we have no time to talk about what we do and who we are. But it always seemed to me a horror that Primo Levi felt ashamed of taking the water. Yeah.
Rather than sharing it.
Yeah, because the conditions were so. I mean, it's like Hannah Arendt's criticism of complicity. The condition in the Holocaust. The conditions were so barbaric. No clean hands. Everyone in the grey zone.
Yeah, and of course Levy's argument about the grey zone is that in the grey zone you can't make judgments.
Yeah.
But I think that's why he's written an essay about shame, because implicit in your response is the idea that he's more Christian than he realised. Perhaps the Catholicism leaked in. Jean-Marie always called him the forgiver, and he got very angry about that. So maybe it's related to that.
Jean-Marie, another Holocaust.
Yes, another Holocaust, a prisoner of the Third Reich in the lager adjacent to Primo Levi, whose time there overlapped with Levi, but who emerged from that experience, like Tadeusz Borowski, the Polish inmate of the lagers, who wrote some extraordinary stories about that experience. All three of them suicides, all three of them people who emerged damaged from that in profound ways, but all of whom have quite different responses, moral and political responses to the meaning of what they suffered.
I realise I can get lost in so many, pulled into so many directions in talking to you, and I want to circle back to that moment in the 80s when you start publishing political academic writing. You talked about the Empire Strikes Back collection. Just before that, you published in Race and Class Journal a sort of version of the argument there. And then in 1985 in Capital and Class, the Journal of the Great Conference of Socialist Economists. And I'm struck by this period of your work as an attempt to enrich Marxism under a set of influences, including C.L.R. James, who we haven't talked about really, the stress on, perhaps it would seem to me sometimes too much optimism about the spontaneous militancy of the most oppressed and exploited sections of the working class. But your turn to black, often unemployed, often declared criminal young people in Britain, as something very different from a later kind of politics of recognition for specific harms, specific wrongs, and instead as the attempt to find the vehicle for a universal, to find models for a universal politics. You talk about sections of the working class outside the problem of corporatism and parliamentarism, of seeing class politics as being about getting a slightly better pay packet and getting a Labour MP, people who are excluded from that by racism and sometimes by lacking citizenship later and all kinds of.
Right.
So in that early work, it seems to me you're trying to say, how can we find possibilities for universal freedom in experiences which might have been marginalised by a Marxism that was focused on the stably employed industrial worker, the aristocracy of labour. Yeah. Is that a fair reading of that early work?
Yeah, I think that's a generous reading. Thank you for it. I mean, obviously, exposure to the aristocracy of labour, so-called, and obviously Du Bois had one meaning when he spoke of the aristocracy of labour, and Lenin had or Hobson, or whoever it was, had a slightly different one. But they're onto a problem, and we had lived in Birmingham through watching the relationship. I think we were living in Roy Hattersley's constituency.
So right-wing deputy leader of the Labour Party.
So Labourism, corporatism, all of these things are hardwired into the way the city's governed, and the drama of these different interests, the Trades Council, the Longbridge workers in the car factory, and then the kids on the street when youth unemployment is at sort of extraordinary. There's an extraordinary level. This is the sort of everyday drama of politics, and is it possible to begin to think about institutional changes which can address that? I mean, obviously, when I wrote the things that you mentioned, I wasn't an academic. I was trying to get a job as an academic. I'm not going to say that I don't know why I did that. I did want to do that, but what I was doing is writing endless journalism and then a few sort of academic-y things in the background while trying to finish my thesis. And those things were important to me because I felt there was a constituency, or I thought there was a constituency around a left culture, where those interventions were worth making, even if people didn't spontaneously agree. There was something to be said for that. And I think there's somewhere in Ain't No Black in the Union Jack, which is from a slightly later period, where I just say to the reader, I really don't know if I can be bothered to work so hard to find the register, to privilege that conversation over the other conversations that are now functioning for me. And there's that moment. I remember writing it. I don't know where it is, but I do know.
No, it seems to me that There Ain't No Black in the Union Jack, 1987,
is the other side.
There's slightly something different.
I've crossed over.
Something different. Because in that early work, the attempt is very much to clarify a particular Marxism, which means to clarify the image of the working class as the universal subject that's going to liberate everyone. And you just want to enrich how people think about that class by stressing experiences that fall outside us. And, that's what you're interested in languages of criminality and as being adopted on the left. Well, someone's a criminal, so they're outside my interests. You want to challenge all of that and also to mobilise a concept, and this endures in your work, of community, which is both a real present experience of how political subjects get made, and also a kind of norm for the future of how we might live with each other.
Absolutely.
So that kind of, I think, endures from the early 80s. But the Jamesian, Jamesian period of trying to find a political subject called the working class and just to enrich what it is, by the time we get to There Ain't No Black in the Union Jack, you say, not all relations of subordination that interest me are necessarily class relations.
Yeah, and I think, obviously, C.L.R. James, I wouldn't be sitting here talking to you if it wasn't for him. So I owe him an enormous amount of clarity, of ambition, of cast of mind, because I was doing so much journalism, I got a chance to go and interview him. And that was, in fact, when Ain't No Black in... No, when Empire Strikes Back came out, I think I must have sent him a copy. And with a note just saying, this is what we did, and we were always talking about your work and so on. And that, in a way, we'd come to James, the Sojourner Truth Organization. Do you know what that is?
Yeah.
You do?
Yeah.
This is a sort of US left sect of a certain vintage. And they had done a special issue to commemorate James'
80th birthday,
his 80th birthday.
Yeah, it's an amazing issue that people should read. It's online on the Marxist Internet Archive.
I didn't know that.
It's some wonderful essays.
Please do seek it out.
Yeah.
Peter Linebaug's essay on the Jubilees in there. C.L.R. James, I think, has an essay in there. And I, in a way, I'd sort of found my way in. I found my way to James not through. When I read Black Jacobins in the beginning, the first time I read it as an undergraduate, I didn't understand its relationship with Marxism at all. I thought it was coming from a different place. I didn't, I'd never heard of the Forrest Johnson tendency. I didn't know, I hadn't read James' conversations with Trotsky in Mexico. I didn't know who Rosa Luxemburg. Well, I sort of beginning to know who Rosa, but I didn't put them together. So, the group Socialism ou Barbarie, Socialism or Barbarism.
French libertarians.
French liberation, but actually connected to James, Castoriadis, Grace Boggs. This is an interesting kind of multinational intervention in Marxism. And it's connected not just to theory, but to the life of the workers in the auto production in Detroit, who are reading James's book, Notes on Dialectics, while in between making the cars on the line in the classic Fordist arrangement. So this was all a kind of revelation. I don't think I got this so much into focus until after I'd met Cedric Robinson in 1978, 79. Before that, it was something that I had come to me through reading Italian reading the Italian translations of council, and the Dutch people, Panikkot
1920s and 30s.
20s, but also the Italian stuff that Ed Emery was translating as red notes and circulating.
Yes,
and
which is later stuff, 70s operisti stuff. Ferruccio Gambino and these people.
You know, to Mario Tronti and Sergio Bologna and so on. So I guess, you know, I was interested in Marxism. I'm not going to deny that I was. I was interested in Marxism, and I was looking for those little things in Marxism that point towards it. So Luxembourg, Dutch Council, communism, all of those things were fueling my curiosity. And then I met Cedric. And Cedric Robinson, the African-American historian, philosopher, anthropologist, you know, who is over in this country writing Black Marxism, and living in a village in Essex. I think it's in Essex, maybe in Cambridgeshire, Radwinter, just along the road from Raymond Williams, funnily enough. I used to sort of imagine that they might bump into each other in Waitrose or something. While this was going, I got a bit friendly with Cedric. Cedric was involved with the Institute of Race Relations, as was I for a short time. And Cedric, I mean, again, I didn't always agree with him, but he was remarkably interesting because he knew all kinds of stuff about the Forrest Johnson tendency. He had a way of...
The Forrest Johnson, which explained was C.L.R. James and others, is sort of quite libertarian Marxist group with initially Raya Dunayevskaya, who had known Trotsky in Mexico, and James Boggs and Grace Lee Boggs in America, in Detroit.
Yes,
they were based.
That's right. And I think maybe Cedric put me on to reading Harry Cleaver's book.
Oh, nice.
Reading Capital Politically.
Yes, who came out of that same tradition.
Yeah, and still alive.
Yes.
Although I don't know that anybody ever asks him about any of this anymore. Maybe they do, and we just don't know. Anyway, so I think Cedric was a revelation to that extent because it gave me a structure. And although I loved James and I admired him deeply, I found some of his political positions a little bit odd, because if you look back over the old issues of Race Today, for example,
which was a publication in Britain that came out of James's influence in some sense, because Darcus Howe's editor was a relative of James and influenced very much by Jamesian politics, a kind of libertarian, kind of autonomous Marxism.
Yes, I think that's true. The Race Today collective publishing, you know, an important, lively, seamless commentary on British politics from their office in Brixton without support from anybody. They were raising that money and organising that for themselves for a number of years, and it's the most precious. I mean, the history of the magazine, its relationship, the Institute of Race Relations, and when that was an official body and they split off, and all of that. I'm just not going to tell that story because it's been told. But I think what was important to me is that it becomes a kind of publication of record, tracking through the history of black settlement and the history of struggles sequentially over many decades. And but, you know, James, when Enoch Powell is blathering on, James is saying, well, Enoch Powell proves that the British working class has rejected racism. Right. You know. Right. I just look at that and I think, really? Right. And then he'll say, OK, so now we can all join the police, you know. Right. Because the conditions are right for that now. Right. Because, and I just felt this was kind of tone deaf to what was actually happening in the culture, in the country at that time. So I was a little bit sort of, as it were, generationally estranged from James, even though I spent a couple of days with him, you know, watching the cricket and talking about nothing very much.
But it always seems to me there's a slight tension between the project of cultural studies and the project of a Jamesian Marxism that, as you say, there's this very rich ecology that James shares with someone like Castoriadis, Socialism or Barbarism, with that Dutch council communist tradition of Panikkot and then Paul Matic, and then with Italian workerism or Operisti. These traditions that you've named, Rosa Luxemburg often brought into that category. Have often expressed their hostility, which I think you were attracted to because of the centrality of a concept of freedom to them, have often expressed their hostility to bureaucratic domination, and whether it's the party, vanguard party, or the state bureaucrat, have often expressed that opposition through an intense faith in the spontaneous creativity of working class people, which has its beauty. But the project of cultural studies was also about saying we're all made in ways more complicated and deeper than just a kind of beautiful reaction to oppression. We're also shaped in messier and sometimes nastier ways that have to be worked through. So, I mean, would it be fair to say that you drew from that Jamesian tradition a way of enriching Marxism, of turning to some of those excluded from the focus just on the car workers at Longbridge? But you ran up against the limits of its optimism in 1980s Britain.
Yeah, I think that's true. And also, I think I was writing, I was someone who's a recovering musician. I was writing endlessly about what's going on in the black musical traditions and output of the long 1970s. And I'm trying to read all that music, whether it's reggae or soul or jazz. I'm trying to read it all in the context of what it says about freedom and the way in which it enacts the drama and the conflicts around the transformation of black politics, albeit in a sort of distorting mirror, you know, of mass consumption. So I'm trying to do this, and I'm trying to kind of abuse my position as a journalist by going around to interview all the people who I think are interesting and all the people who have influenced me, and having some very strange kind of encounters with them, which make me much more pessimistic, I think we can say, about the cultural dimensions of this transformation and the technological dimensions of this transformation. And you know, around that time I was also a little bit involved in pirate radio, and we were trying to, because of the ways that we imagined that free and open communication in a city like this would enhance the interests of these marginal groups, but also I don't mean that you'd be reading out leaflets or anything, but there are ways of creating and interacting with an emergent public that the technological opportunities that fell to us at that moment allowed us to glimpse or to hear approaching. I mean, obviously there's another argument in relation to Marxism or post-Marxism that makes use of this, and thinking about Kluge and Necht and the idea of the public sphere and what public spheres are and how many more, not just Walter Benjamin saying there's a public sphere of children, there's a public sphere of pirate radio, there's a public sphere of post-migration, generations of black politics coming to understand themselves through the self-emancipation that culture affords, not work. So I'm sort of really trying to think those problems through and participating in all of that in several different roles, and trying then to bring the fruits of that exposure back into my more sort of theoretical writing, whilst wondering whether I'm ever going to have a job being an academic, you know.
One of the really rich experiences of that kind of confluence is seeing in There Ain't No Black in the Union Jack the way you read lots of music. You read Sugar Hill Gang and you read lots of reggae as expressing a hostility to work and a celebration of desire and creativity against work in ways that you connect to deindustrialization and the loss of the dream of stable life of work, to André Gortz's writing in French, which you were part of sort of bringing to the awareness of British readers, French Marxist, post-Marxist writer, Farewell to the Proletariat. And at one point in There Ain't No Black, you talk about Gorz's 3-point utopian program: work less, consume better, reintegrate culture with everyday life. And so you're trying
and
to
we're still stuck with that.
I just think it's so pressing to us now, because you're trying to find, it seems to me, go back to that German tradition, in that tradition of immanent critique, you're trying to find immanent resources for thinking about freedom, immanent not to Karl Marx's 19th century Manchester, but immanent to late 20th century deindustrializing Britain. There's a moment where you quote Marx's passage from the Grundrisse on Jamaica, where Marx talks about the freedom immanent to the experience of formerly enslaved people in Jamaica, which is free time from labour.
Yeah.
And Marx means that to say that's not the kind of freedom relevant to him, but you find it's relevant.
Yes, and it's there. It's there. So I mean, okay, it's his notebook, so let's not get it out of proportion. But that was terribly important for me to discover that there, and it helped me in the same way that reading his newspaper articles for the New York Tribune or whatever it was called, about the 1857
in India
national uprising in India. So yeah, I mean, there are many important things to find and to salvage from those sources, and yeah, I mean, I stopped calling myself a Marxist or wanting to call myself a Marxist a long time ago, but I've never stopped reading Marx, and I've never stopped thinking with and against him, and it's immensely instructive. And the thing that broke me with Marxism more, I think, than these questions, which are, if you read his historical writings about particular kind of concrete instances, like the 18th Brumaire, the warrant for Eurocommunism, the thing that really got to me more, and I found more uncomfortable, was this question of his. It's really this sense that he has a very triumphalist view of the relationship between humankind and the natural world, and that's a problem. That's a problem, and I know that there's John Bellamy Foster and there's Ted Benton and the people arguing about these things, and there's a whole lot to say about connecting historical materialism to a certain set of German scientific questions or forms of vitalist argument in German chemistry from the 19th century.
Yeah, Kohei Saito writes about Marx and Liebig.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. I think we have to do much better than that now. And those problems look different when you put entropy there, and when you think about the second law of thermodynamics, and when you think about the relationship of Marxism and Engels, actually, in particular, to Liebig and all those arguments about and which, it must be said. I mean, I think when Marx, I know there's all this stuff, we talked about this once before, the question of the idiocy of rural life and all of that. I think, Marx is they're city boys. They're not people who want. They do believe that the tempo of a life in which you are in thrall to the caprices of the natural world, is not good to fostering the particular kind of consciousness that will allow you to find the exit. I don't think that. I mean, maybe, I know this is a big argument, but for me, I can't see the argument that makes Marx, someone who is really open to these forms of rural transformation.
Well, he assumes a very positive relationship between freedom and technology, which it seems to me is something you're going to want to sort of push against. That, we've talked before about both of us having a soft spot for Luddites, and for Luddism, and he assumes a story of progress, which is about human domination over the natural world and increasing technology allowing an increasing freedom. And one of the rich things about that Jamaica discussion is it's a different kind of freedom. It's not machines making people not labour. It's just, he says, idle time as freedom.
Absolutely. But there's the reason I mentioned entropy is because very early on in our project of Emergency, which was a journal we tried to create for ourselves, there's a man, I don't know.
In the late 80s.
In the late 80s. I don't know if he's still alive. There's a guy called Robin Jenkins, who had been a sociologist and had been kicked out of Essex at the time of Essex rebellion, and then had been kicked out of Sussex because he had tried to get the professoriate to join the same union as the cleaners or something. And he had gone off to Portugal after the revolution in Portugal and set up a farm. And set up a farm in a sort of, in a very inhospitable agricultural environment, and wrote a book about his year of trying to farm there and trying to make that work. Anyway, Robin wrote a piece for us in Emergency, which is really about the antagonism between red and green perspectives. And he just really laid out the question of the second law of thermodynamics and what Marx and the difficulties that Marx and Engels had with the second law of thermodynamics, and the idea that that you could go on baking a bigger cake constantly, that there was no constraint. So I think for me that was the final piece for me that said, you know what, and at that time I think I'd begun to read Bookchin quite carefully. Murray Bookchin, the libertarian anarchist who was a great polemicist against Marxism in its Stalinist and Trotskyist iterations, who was always somebody who had seen a political ecology as essential and fundamental to the nature of revolutionary transformation, and had established the Institute for Social Ecology in Burlington, Vermont, where Bernie Sanders was the mayor. And of course, Murray wrote some excoriating things against Bernie Sanders in his role as a local politician in Burlington, Vermont. Anyway, I'd started to read Bookchin and I was, enthused greatly by reading Bookchin. And Bookchin came and spoke at St Mary's Piccadilly one afternoon, the weekend, and that was very. All these old blokes, were always, they're never quite live, face to face. They're never quite what you think they're going to be from the page. And I had that experience with Castoriadis and with James. And I had it again with Bookchin, but he was still fiery. He was a fiery character, and the rhetoric and the seamlessness with which the political ecology was figured within, in opposition to environmentalism and Marxism, was very exciting to behold.
Opposition to environmentalism, how?
Well, he would dismiss Gorz as an environmentalist, and actually saying you're sort of halfway there, but there's a much more thoroughgoing and comprehensive transformation that is required of you, and it takes you into a different relationship to the state, for example.
One of the traditions that's sometimes blamed for elevating human beings above and against the natural world is the tradition that gets called humanism. And you have implored us to rediscover and celebrate humanism, which pushes against so many 20th century critical inheritances, the philosophical critique of humanism that stressed that the human shouldn't be the starting point, the human is made by social forces, political worry about the way that when you try to define the human, people always get excluded. But you've stressed, and this has been a consistent focus of a lot of your recent writing, and I think you're now writing a book on humanism. And it is quite striking in the anti-colonial tradition that whether it's Fanon or Frantz Fanon or Edward Said or C.L.R. James or W.B. Du Bois, how much humanism there is.
Césaire, don't leave out Césaire.
Césaire and Senghor. And there's a wonderful moment in your writing where you talk about Malcolm X in that moment of breaking with the Nation of Islam and discovering a universalist politics, saying civil rights is the name for an American problem, but this is a human problem. Tell us more about why you think humanism is a rich category.
You've set me up beautifully for that, because really the question of what it is to undo the racial order was fundamental to the breakthrough to a different kind of conversation about what being human entailed. And and each of the figures that you've mentioned and a number of others we could add to that realised that and decided to do that.
Well, one thing I wonder, you're here in a beautiful Arsenal special shirt that says human race. And you've been clear that it's to some extent a strategic claim, but not in a way that minimises what it is to be strategic. That in a world in which people are told they belong to races and also that they belong to nations, and you've been consistently opposed to all kinds of nationalism, to say that we belong to something called the human race is in fact a very challenging and provocative claim to all of the divisions in which we live. One question I have about that is whether it's kind of a... And to be honest, this is something I find very rich about this point, that it's a way of answering the difficulty of immanent critique in our world. That if in the early 1980s you wanted to find a way of talking about class as a universal experience, if by the later 1980s you wanted to talk about class and race as things which could be negated in order to produce a kind of freedom, when it's hard to name the particular experiences, the particular people in particular places who have the leverage to change the world, do we fall back on an insistence, not in a bad way, an insistence on the human, as actually in all times and places there is a possibility of freedom, because there's something about being human that wants to live in community with others?
Yeah, I think that's true, but there are two other factors which are, as it were, contingencies that sort of pressured me to do this more aggressively than I might normally have wanted to do. And the first of those really is the transformation of the climate and the climate emergency and the forms of connectedness, the forms of sympathy, the forms of intervention, that being able to address the pressures of the horrors of the... I don't want to keep... I got told off for saying climate catastrophe, so let's say climate emergency. So I think that's one thing, that we were able in earlier periods to exclude that from the conditions in which we imagined the conversation or the adjustment conceptually was going to take place. And I think it's been true for a long time that we can't do that anymore, even though there are many people who still are trying to do that. I'm just trying to think, is there anyone on the left who's still trying to do that? Yes, actually, there are lots of people on the left who still don't get that, what the difference that makes. And the other thing is, and this really relates, and it's of course connected to the question of the climate, but it relates to what we learned from the pandemic and the ways in which forms of social inequality and vulnerability were unevenly distributed. I mean, this is a problem we know from thinking about so-called natural disasters in general. And you made the point earlier on about the distribution of risk and vulnerability being overlaid, in a way that is mystifying by a rhetoric of interchangeability and equality, which is clearly negated by everything we know about the way our world works. But I think, for me, whilst recognizing every part of that critique of the pandemic, there's also another layer that relates perhaps more generally to questions of suffering and how suffering is perceived and responded to, and that goes back, I suppose, over a longer historical arc for me into arguments about the abolition of enslavement and how that particular movement unfolded, was mediated technologically, culturally, by language, by imagination, by art, by literary texts. I mean, in Darker Than Blue, I spent quite a lot of time exploring the publishing history of Uncle Tom's Cabin and trying to show that there was a value in that, albeit sentimental and in some places racist representation of black life by somebody who, plagiarized large chunks of the story from an actual African-American person who'd been himself enslaved, Josiah Henson. I think in spite of all of that, there are forms of sympathy, forms of response, forms of care that are not reducible to their social, to their sociality. Actually, they kind of precede. They precede that sociality. And there are ways in which that appeal and that series of responses can be made, philosophically speaking, can be given a much greater significance than they... So it's not about, a subject-centered approach to thinking of philosophy or, Levinas, the sense of alterity, the engagement with alterity as
Emmanuel Levinas, whose ethics is based on the encounter with the other.
With other, yes. Or with anything that has a face. With anything that has a face. In Levinas, it's about having a face. It's about the concept of the face. And it's about managing how, when I'm here and you're you, and I'm looking into your face, Barnaby, and together you're looking into my face, and together that mutual recognition composes a third thing, which is also something we have to kind of recognize and engage. So I would look at that as a failed instance of the kind of thing that I'm talking about, precisely because it wasn't in the abstract able to understand that relationship, although it couldn't really, I think, understand it outside of a theological context. And in concrete terms, in the concrete terms of the sort of Zionist colonial project, it couldn't actually endow the Arab other, not yet the Muslim other, with the same attributes of selfhood that were enjoyed by the other side of the couple, the dyad. So I think we can do better than that, and I want us to do better than that, and I want to show how the history of our archive in the Black Atlantic world and its kind of supplements in other directions can be used to make that a more attractive prospect. And I think the reason I'm cautious with this is partly because I think the appetite for chaos, the appetite for death, the appetite for oblivion are very strong in human beings, and I don't assume in mobilizing my counter to that there's any reason that I would be able to surpass that. But I can stage it. I can stage the drama of that encounter.
You've described yourself as a cosmic pessimist.
Yeah.
But it seems to me, there's also a will for optimism in some of your work, and maybe you'll disagree with this, but in facing post-colonial melancholia and saying, actually, in the here and now of the Britain that we live in, there is a conviviality where people live together and create. Keir Starmer became fond of talking about politics of place. And sometimes people think that means some claim about places that have been the same for hundreds of years or so. But you have a kind of politics of place, of the reality of places that change, that are made. In the Black Atlantic, it's through a concept of diaspora, which is, Stuart Hall once said, diaspora is the enemy of all identity politics, because it's an idea of people who are dispersed into different places that we try to share with others. And one of the things I found richest about your... one of the things I found spoke to me most about the Black Atlantic is the defense of the concept of diaspora against those who would seek to collapse it, like in my own experience, Zionists, who want to have a pure relationship to place, to say we own this space, other people don't belong here. Your humanism is about asking what kinds of places we can make and share with others.
Yeah, and we can't rewind history to make that possible. And I think there I benefited greatly from a conversation with some Jewish thinkers who were opposed to Zionism, although often, opposed to Zionism precisely because they considered themselves to be profoundly, and in many respects, deeply religious Jews, for whom, the State of Israel would always be something they could see as a kind of Germanic project.
It's an attempt to become European.
Century. Exactly. Yeah. And who embraced diaspora and said, well, actually, the language of this diaspora is not Hebrew at all. It's Yiddish.
Absolutely.
Actually, and these things are in some respects historically antagonistic. Not always, but that's something to think with. So Jonathan Boyarin in particular was someone who was very, very helpful to me in thinking through some of these things, and he and his brother, I think, have been consistently among the most vocal advocates for that kind of argument. So that was enriching. Yes, I mean, diaspora, the enemy of identity politics. I think I wanted to try to supplement that idea with an argument that I took from, or an idea or concept I took from Ivan Illich's writing. Of course, Illich and Gorz were at school together. Their work evolves together over a long period of time, although Illich is a Catholic of a certain fundamentalist kind, but they both have this argument about cars and the antisocial consequences
the social ideology of the motor car, as the Gorz has an amazing essay.
At that time, I was a non-driver. I'm now a non-driver again. But I think the concept that I took from military is really this idea of conviviality. And coming here on the train today, I was looking around. It's a hot day. Yes, the Elizabeth line trains are, they are air conditioned to some degree. But the forms of spontaneous care and concern that people exhibit for one another in a situation where we're told there's no mixing and there's no prospect of integration, is always a great source of joy for me. And I'm not complacent about that because I know it's fragile, but it is there, and nobody on the left I ever read ever took any of that into account in figuring what they wanted and how we were going to get there. I just never saw it. And it's certainly not there in these sort of constant drift into kind of ever more grotesque, imitative postures where you're trying to sock puppet the kind of xenophobic, fascistic voices coming from the right, and somehow think that because your hand's up there in the sock, the outcome's going to be different. So I'm in that sense I'm a Londoner who believes that somehow or peculiarly there are prefigurative possibilities of generosity and togetherness that are evident in our everyday experience that don't get much of an airing, and I would like to give some value to those things too.
Paul, that is wonderful, and I really feel that we're just getting going. But alas, I'm told by the crew here that they have to film something else and we have to wrap up.
Okay.
So I'm just delighted.
Thank you.
I'm just delighted that you came and joined me today.
Thank you.
We have so much more to discuss, but I'm so grateful to you. And thank you to everyone for watching and listening. And if you enjoyed this podcast, make sure to subscribe to Tribune at tribunemag.co.uk/subscribe. I've been Barnaby Rain. This is Paul Gilroy.
Thank you very much for having me, Barnaby.
And see you next time.